When Jesus spoke those 3 words on the cross, "It is finished," he wasn't talking about his life ending. He was revealing the greatest spiritual secret ever given to humanity. Most people miss this completely. They think it was a statement of defeat, a final breath, a tragic ending. But Joel Goldsmith discovered what Jesus really meant, and when you understand this, your entire life transforms. What if I told you that every problem you're facing right now, every financial struggle, every health concern, every relationship conflict was already resolved 2,000 years ago? Not in some distant heaven, but in the eternal now of spiritual reality. This isn't religious doctrine. This is mystical truth that changes everything when you truly grasp it. Jesus wasn't saying his mission was complete. He was declaring that the entire human struggle, the illusion of separation from God, the belief in lack and limitation, was finished, done, completed. Not by his death, but by his realization. And that same realization is available to you right now, in this very moment. Here's what Joel Goldsmith taught about these words. In spiritual consciousness, there is no healing to be done because there is no actual disease. There is no supply to demonstrate because infinite abundance already exists. There is no relationship to fix because love is already whole. Everything you think you need to achieve, acquire, or become has already been accomplished in divine reality. The reason your prayers seem unanswered isn't because God isn't listening. It's because you're asking for something that already exists. Imagine standing in a river, dying of thirst, begging God for water. The water is already there. You don't need more water. You need to recognize the water surrounding you. This is what "it is finished" means in practical terms. Most spiritual teaching tells you to work harder, pray longer, visualize better, raise your vibration. But Goldsmith discovered that all spiritual work is actually letting go of the belief that work needs to be done. The finished kingdom is already here. Your job isn't to create it. Your job is to recognize it. This recognition is what transforms everything. Let me show you how this works in daily life. When you face a financial emergency, your natural response is panic, followed by desperate prayer. You ask God to send money, to open doors, to provide miraculously. But if it is finished, then the supply already exists in consciousness. Your work isn't begging or manifesting. Your work is resting in the truth that divine abundance is already established. This doesn't mean sitting passively while bills pile up. It means taking inspired action from a consciousness of completeness rather than lack. When you know it is finished, you move through the world differently. You make phone calls from peace, not desperation. You seek solutions from wisdom, not fear. The external actions may look similar, but the consciousness behind them changes everything. Joel Goldsmith healed thousands of people using this principle. When someone came to him with cancer, he didn't see cancer to heal. He saw the finished spiritual perfection that was always true. His recognition of completeness allowed their consciousness to shift. Not always instantly, sometimes gradually over weeks, but the transformation came from recognizing what was already finished. The technique is deceptively simple, which is why most people miss it. When a problem appears, your first response should be silence. Not prayer for change, but recognition of truth. Sit quietly and acknowledge. In spiritual reality, this is already finished. God's work is complete. What appears as a problem is only my limited perception of something already resolved in divine consciousness. You don't need to feel this truth emotionally at first. You simply need to acknowledge it mentally, repeatedly, until your consciousness shifts. It might take 5 minutes or 5 weeks. The timeline doesn't matter because in spiritual reality, time doesn't exist. What exists is the eternal finished nature of God's creation, which includes you, your body, your relationships, your supply. This isn't positive thinking or affirmation work. This is recognition of what is already spiritually true. When you stop trying to make something happen and start recognizing what has already happened in consciousness, you align with divine reality. That alignment is what we call healing, prosperity, harmony. But these aren't achievements. They're recognitions of the finished kingdom that was always here. Sarah was a single mother facing eviction with 3 children and $72 in her bank account. She had prayed desperately for weeks, cried herself to sleep, applied for every assistance program available. Nothing changed. Then she encountered Joel Goldsmith's teaching on "It is finished." At first, she thought it was cruel spiritual bypass. How could her crisis already be resolved when the eviction notice was real? But something in the teaching resonated. She began practicing recognition instead of petition. Every morning for 2 weeks, she sat in silence, acknowledging that in spiritual reality, her supply was already complete. She didn't feel peaceful immediately. She didn't see money appear. But slowly, her consciousness shifted from panic to quiet certainty. She still took action, still applied for jobs, still made calls. In the 3rd week, a former colleague called about a job she hadn't applied for. The timing was perfect, the salary exactly what she needed. Was this coincidence? Perhaps. But Sarah noticed that the opportunity came only after her consciousness shifted from desperately seeking to quietly knowing. The external provision matched her internal recognition that it was already finished. Marcus struggled with chronic pain for 8 years after a car accident. Multiple surgeries provided temporary relief but never lasting healing. He tried every spiritual technique, positive affirmations, energy healing, meditation retreats. Some things helped briefly, but the pain always returned. When he learned about recognizing completion instead of seeking healing, he felt skeptical but desperate enough to try anything. For 6 weeks, Marcus practiced resting in the truth that in God's reality, his body was already perfect and whole. He didn't deny the pain or pretend it wasn't there. He acknowledged it as a limited perception of something already resolved spiritually. He continued physical therapy and proper medical care, but his inner work shifted from fighting pain to recognizing perfection. The change wasn't dramatic or instant. Around week 7, he realized he'd gone 2 days without thinking about the pain. By week 12, the intensity had decreased by 60%. 6 months later, the chronic pain was gone. His doctors couldn't explain it medically, but Marcus understood. When his consciousness recognized the finished work, his physical experience aligned with that recognition gradually over time. Jennifer and Robert's marriage was ending after 19 years. The resentment was deep, communication had completely broken down, and divorce papers were being prepared. Neither wanted this outcome, but both felt powerless to change the toxic dynamic. A friend gave Jennifer a Joel Goldsmith book about recognizing spiritual wholeness in relationships. She began practicing alone. Every time anger arose toward Robert, she paused and silently recognized, in spiritual truth, love is already complete between us. This isn't wishful thinking. This is recognition of divine reality. She didn't tell Robert what she was doing. She just shifted her own consciousness from seeing a broken marriage to recognizing the finished nature of love itself. Nothing changed for 3 weeks. Then Robert noticed something different about Jennifer, though he couldn't identify what. The atmosphere between them softened slightly. They began having actual conversations instead of arguments. It took 7 months of Jennifer's consistent practice before Robert asked what had changed in her. They didn't have a fairy tale reconciliation, but they rebuilt their marriage on a foundation of recognizing spiritual completeness rather than trying to fix human brokenness. These stories aren't exceptional miracles. They're natural results of aligning consciousness with spiritual truth. Joel Goldsmith worked with thousands of students who experienced similar transformations. Some changes happened quickly, others gradually over months. But the principle remained consistent. When you stop trying to make something happen and start recognizing what is already finished in divine consciousness, your experience shifts. The key difference between this approach and typical manifestation teaching is the foundation. You're not trying to create, attract, or manifest something new. You're recognizing something eternally present. This removes the strain, the desperation, the feeling that you must do more to be worthy of receiving. It is already finished. Your worthiness was established before you were born. This doesn't mean you become passive or stop taking action. It means your actions come from recognition rather than lack, from certainty rather than hope, from knowing rather than seeking. This shift in consciousness is subtle, but profoundly powerful. It's the difference between swimming desperately toward shore and realizing you're already standing on solid ground. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others find these teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment. Which story resonated most deeply with your current situation? Now let me give you 3 specific practices that deepen your recognition of the finished kingdom. The first is what Goldsmith called the practice of the presence. This means training yourself to acknowledge God's complete presence in every moment, especially when problems appear. Not God who will help you, but God whose perfect work is already established right where the problem seems to be. When you wake up anxious about your day, pause before getting out of bed. Spend 60 seconds in silent recognition. God's presence is here now, complete and perfect. Whatever this day holds is already resolved in divine consciousness. I'm not entering a day of problems to solve. I'm entering a day of recognizing the finished kingdom. This isn't prayer for help. This is acknowledgement of present spiritual reality. Throughout your day, whenever tension arises, return to this recognition. In a difficult meeting, silently acknowledge, God's perfect harmony is already present here. In a financial crisis, recognize, divine supply is already complete in this situation. You're not creating these realities. You're recognizing them. This practice trains your consciousness to default to spiritual truth rather than material appearance. The second technique is what Goldsmith called resting in the Word. When you read or hear a spiritual truth that resonates deeply, don't just acknowledge it intellectually and move on. Rest in it. Let it saturate your consciousness. If the statement, "It is finished," strikes you as profound, spend time just sitting with those words, not analyzing them, not trying to make them work, just resting in their truth. This is completely different from affirmation work. You're not repeating words to make something happen. You're allowing a spiritual truth to reveal its own meaning to your consciousness. Sometimes this takes 5 minutes, sometimes an hour. Joel Goldsmith would often spend entire sessions just resting in a single statement of truth, letting it unfold its deeper meaning. You might rest in "It is finished" for days or weeks, returning to it again and again. Each time, the meaning deepens. First, you understand it intellectually. Then you begin to feel it emotionally. Eventually, it becomes your consciousness, the lens through which you perceive all of life. This is when transformation becomes natural and consistent rather than occasional and unpredictable. The third practice is recognizing spiritual identity. Most of your problems exist because you identify as a limited human being who needs things, lacks things, struggles with things. But in spiritual reality, your identity is already complete as the expression of divine consciousness. You're not a person trying to reach God. You're God's finished expression, mistakenly believing you're separate and limited. When a health issue arises, your typical response is, "I have a sick body that needs healing." But the recognition of spiritual identity shifts this to, "I am the perfect expression of divine life. What appears as sickness is a misperception of my already established spiritual wholeness." This isn't denial of symptoms. This is recognition of deeper truth underneath appearances. Practice this identity recognition throughout your day. Instead of "I need more money," recognize, "I am the expression of infinite divine supply." Instead of "I need healing," recognize, "I am the manifestation of perfect spiritual wholeness." These aren't affirmations to make something happen. They're recognitions of what is already eternally true in consciousness. Your experience gradually aligns with your recognized identity. These 3 practices work together to deepen your consciousness of completion. The practice of the presence keeps you anchored in spiritual reality moment by moment. Resting in the Word allows spiritual truth to transform your understanding. Recognizing spiritual identity shifts your fundamental sense of who you are from limited human to complete divine expression. Joel Goldsmith emphasized that these aren't techniques to get something you lack. They're practices to recognize what you already are and have in spiritual consciousness. The more you practice, the more natural this recognition becomes. Eventually, you don't have to consciously practice because your default consciousness is recognition of the finished kingdom. This transition takes time for most people. Don't expect instant mastery. Joel himself practiced for years before this consciousness became natural and consistent. But even in the early stages, you'll notice shifts. Problems that once devastated you become minor inconveniences. Lack that once terrified you becomes temporary appearance. The finished kingdom starts revealing itself in your daily experience. Let's address the biggest obstacle most people face with this teaching. When you're in genuine crisis, when the pain is real, when the bank account is actually empty, recognizing it is finished can feel like spiritual bypass. You might think, this is just denial. I'm ignoring reality. I'm pretending problems don't exist. This resistance is completely normal and actually healthy. Here's what Joel Goldsmith taught about this challenge. You're not denying the appearance. You're not pretending the problem doesn't exist on the human level. You're recognizing that beneath the appearance is a spiritual reality that is already complete. Both levels exist simultaneously. The appearance is what you see with human eyes. The reality is what exists in divine consciousness. The mistake most people make is trying to jump directly from seeing the problem to feeling complete peace about it. That's not how consciousness shifts. First, you acknowledge the appearance honestly. Yes, the bank account is empty. Yes, the pain is real. Yes, the relationship is broken. Then, underneath that acknowledgement, you begin recognizing, and yet in spiritual consciousness, this is already resolved. Both truths coexist until consciousness fully shifts. The second major challenge is impatience. You practice recognition for 3 days, and when nothing changes externally, you conclude it doesn't work. This is where most people abandon the teaching right before breakthrough would occur. Joel Goldsmith was very clear about this. Consciousness shift takes time, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, occasionally months, for deeply ingrained patterns. Think of it this way. You've spent years, maybe decades, building a consciousness of lack, fear, and limitation. That consciousness didn't form overnight, and it won't dissolve overnight. Every time you practice recognition of completion, you're dissolving old patterns and establishing new consciousness. This is gradual work, like strengthening a muscle or learning a language. The key is consistency without attachment to timeline. Practice recognition not because you expect results tomorrow, but because it's the truth regardless of appearances. Some of Goldsmith's students experienced rapid shifts. Others practiced for months before seeing external changes. But every single person who persisted eventually experienced transformation, because consciousness shift always produces corresponding experience. The third challenge is what Goldsmith called taking back the problem. You practice recognition, feel peaceful, maybe even experience some improvement. Then something triggers the old fear and you immediately forget everything you've learned. You're back in panic mode, desperately praying for help, completely forgetting that it is finished. This cycle frustrates people enormously. Joel taught that this is part of the process, not a sign of failure. Old consciousness patterns don't dissolve linearly. They release in layers. You might have genuine recognition of completion, then face a new trigger that brings back old fear. This doesn't mean you've lost your progress. It means another layer is ready to be released. Each time you return to recognition after forgetting, you deepen the new consciousness. The practice here is gentle persistence without self-judgment. When you catch yourself back in fear and striving, don't condemn yourself. Simply recognize, I forgot. Now I remember. It is finished. The issue isn't how many times you forget. The issue is how consistently you return to recognition. Over time, the periods of remembering grow longer and the periods of forgetting grow shorter. The fourth challenge is spiritual isolation. You practice this teaching and start experiencing shifts, but everyone around you still operates from lack consciousness. Your family thinks you're being irresponsible when you remain calm during crisis. Your friends worry you're in denial. Your logical mind questions if you're delusional. This external pressure can shake your conviction. Goldsmith experienced this himself. When he first began practicing recognition of spiritual completeness, people thought he was avoiding reality. Some called him irresponsible. Others said he was in spiritual bypass. But he persisted because he was experiencing results, even when others couldn't understand his approach. He built a community of practitioners who supported each other in this consciousness. You might need to practice quietly without explaining to others what you're doing. Not everyone is ready to understand that all spiritual work is recognition rather than achievement. Find others who practice this consciousness, even if only through books or online communities. Joel Goldsmith's recordings and writings create a consciousness that supports your practice. You're not alone in this, even when it feels that way. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart, like to support this content, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices, and comment. Which obstacle are you ready to transform now? Let me show you how this works in extremely difficult situations. Michael was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and given 3 months to live. He'd been a devoted spiritual student for years, practiced meditation daily, lived consciously. When the diagnosis came, his first response was feeling betrayed. Why wasn't his spiritual practice protecting him? This is the crisis that tests everything you believe. Michael spent 2 weeks in despair before remembering Goldsmith's teaching on completion. He realized he'd been practicing spirituality as insurance against bad things happening. But "it is finished" meant something different. It meant that even in this diagnosis, spiritual perfection was already present. Not that the cancer wasn't real, but that underneath the appearance was unshakable divine wholeness. He began practicing recognition of spiritual completeness while still receiving medical treatment. He wasn't choosing between medicine and spirit. He was recognizing spiritual truth while taking practical human action. For 8 weeks, nothing changed externally. The cancer progressed as predicted. Then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. His pain decreased. His energy returned slightly. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. Michael's story didn't end with instant miraculous healing. It unfolded over 18 months of consistent recognition practice combined with medical care. The cancer went into remission, returned partially, then finally disappeared completely. His doctors called it unexplained spontaneous remission, but Michael understood. His consciousness had shifted from seeing himself as a person with cancer to recognizing his spiritual identity as the perfect expression of divine life. What's most remarkable isn't that the cancer disappeared. It's how Michael lived during those 18 months. He experienced profound peace even when scan results were discouraging. He maintained deep certainty even when symptoms worsened temporarily. His family and friends witnessed someone facing death with inexplicable calm. This peace wasn't denial or resignation. It was the natural result of consciousness anchored in completion. Joel Goldsmith taught that healing isn't really about fixing bodies. It's about consciousness recognizing its own spiritual nature. When that recognition is genuine and sustained, physical healing often follows, but not always instantly and not always in expected ways. The real healing is freedom from fear, which is possible regardless of physical circumstances. Michael discovered this truth through his most difficult trial. Rebecca's business was failing catastrophically. She'd invested everything and was facing bankruptcy that would destroy her financially for years. She'd built this company with pure intention, wanting to serve people and create something meaningful. The failure felt like cosmic punishment. How could she have been so wrong? This is where spiritual teaching meets brutal practical reality. She discovered Goldsmith's work through a friend during her darkest week. The teaching on "it is finished" initially angered her. How dare someone suggest her crisis was already resolved when she was losing everything? But desperation makes you willing to try anything. She began practicing recognition, not because she believed it, but because she had no other options left. For the first month, nothing external changed. The business continued declining. But something subtle shifted internally. Rebecca found herself making clearer decisions from calm rather than panic. She negotiated better terms with creditors. She identified which parts of the business to save and which to release. The ultimate outcome wasn't what she originally wanted. The business did close, but she preserved enough to start fresh without complete devastation. What Rebecca discovered through this process transformed her understanding of completion. "It is finished" didn't mean her business would be saved as she wanted. It meant that in divine consciousness, her true purpose and supply were already established. The business closing was actually part of recognizing completion, not a failure of the principle. Sometimes completion looks like endings, so new beginnings can emerge. 2 years later, Rebecca built a different business aligned more authentically with her gifts. She credits the first business failure as necessary for discovering her true work. But more importantly, she learned that recognizing completion doesn't mean controlling outcomes. It means trusting that whatever unfolds is part of divine perfection, even when it doesn't match your human preferences. This is advanced understanding of Goldsmith's teaching. Completion doesn't mean getting what you want. It means recognizing that divine wisdom is already at work in your life, including through apparent failures and disappointments. When you truly rest in "it is finished," you develop the capacity to see perfection even in unwanted circumstances. This is genuine spiritual maturity, not beginner's magical thinking about manifesting desires. After months or years of practicing recognition of completion, something profound shifts in your consciousness. You stop dividing life into problems and solutions. You stop seeing yourself as someone who needs fixing. You start experiencing life as the continual unfolding of something already complete. This isn't a belief you hold, it's the consciousness you live from. Everything changes from this foundation. You still face challenges, but they don't devastate you. You still experience loss, but it doesn't destroy you. You still encounter difficult people and situations, but they don't control your inner state. Why? Because your identity is no longer tied to circumstances. You know yourself as the finished expression of divine consciousness, and that knowing remains stable regardless of what happens externally. Joel Goldsmith lived from this consciousness for decades. People who knew him described a quality of peace that wasn't dependent on anything, not because his life was perfect or problem-free, but because his consciousness was anchored in spiritual completion. This is available to you, not as a distant goal, but as a present reality you're learning to recognize more consistently. The practical transformation shows up in unexpected ways. You notice you're not obsessively checking your bank balance anymore, not because you suddenly have unlimited wealth, but because your consciousness isn't attached to the numbers. You find yourself in difficult conversations without the old defensive reactions, not because you've learned better communication skills, but because you're not protecting a vulnerable, limited self anymore. Your health becomes more stable. You sleep better. You feel more energy. Not because you're doing special wellness practices, but because anxiety isn't depleting your system constantly. Your relationships improve, even difficult ones. Not because people change, but because you're no longer approaching relationships from need and incompleteness. You have nothing to get from others when you know you're already complete. These changes happen gradually, almost imperceptibly. One day you realize you haven't worried about money in weeks. Another day you notice chronic pain that plagued you for years has quietly disappeared. You find yourself laughing more easily, feeling lighter, experiencing spontaneous joy. These aren't achievements you worked for. They're natural expressions of consciousness recognizing its own completion. Here's what most spiritual teachings won't tell you. Even after years of practice, you'll still have moments of forgetting. You'll still face situations that trigger old fear patterns. You'll still catch yourself striving and seeking instead of recognizing. But these moments become less frequent and less intense. More importantly, you recover faster. You don't spend days or weeks lost in fear before remembering truth. This is the realistic picture of spiritual transformation, not perfection, but progress. Not constant bliss, but increasing peace. Not immunity to challenge, but capacity to remain centered through challenge. Joel Goldsmith never claimed to be beyond human experience. He simply developed the consciousness to recognize spiritual completion more consistently than most people. You're developing the same consciousness. Every time you practice recognition instead of petition, every time you rest in completion instead of striving for achievement, every time you identify as spiritual wholeness instead of limited human, you're building this consciousness. It becomes your natural state gradually, through consistent practice over time. When Jesus said, "It is finished," he was speaking to you across 2,000 years. He was telling you that the spiritual work is already complete. You don't need to become worthy, achieve enlightenment, or earn God's love. You already are the finished expression of divine perfection. Your only work is recognizing this truth consistently enough that your human experience aligns with spiritual reality. This recognition transforms everything. Not because it changes external circumstances, though it often does, but because it changes you. You become someone who lives from completion instead of lack, from certainty instead of fear, from knowing instead of seeking. This is the greatest transformation possible in human consciousness. Joel Goldsmith spent his life helping people discover this truth, not as distant spiritual theory, but as practical daily reality. The same transformation he experienced and facilitated in thousands of others is available to you right now. Not tomorrow, not after more spiritual work, but now. Because it is finished. It always has been. You're simply learning to recognize what was always true. If your spiritual understanding expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, like this video, subscribe for more transformative teachings, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your new path. Joshua sat alone in his apartment, staring at the stack of unpaid bills on his kitchen table. His hands trembled as he calculated the numbers for the third time that evening. The fear was suffocating, wrapping around his chest like a vice. He had lost his job 2 months ago, and despite countless applications, nothing had materialized. His phone buzzed with another notification, probably another creditor. Joshua felt his heart race faster. The anxiety had become his constant companion, whispering worst-case scenarios in his mind every waking moment. He wondered how he would survive another week. That night, unable to sleep, Joshua remembered something his grandmother used to say before she passed. She would often quote Jesus saying, "Fear not," and would smile peacefully even during the hardest times. He had never understood how she maintained such calm in the face of difficulty. Desperate for anything that might bring relief, Joshua opened his laptop and searched for the meaning behind those words. He stumbled upon a lecture by Joel Goldsmith about spiritual principles and the true nature of fear. Something about the title caught his attention, and he pressed play. The voice on the recording spoke with unusual authority and gentleness. Goldsmith explained that fear is not something to be fought or suppressed, but understood. Joshua leaned closer to the screen, his interest suddenly awakened despite his exhaustion. Goldsmith's words began to penetrate Joshua's consciousness. The teacher explained that when Jesus repeatedly said, "Fear not," he was not giving a command to simply stop being afraid. He was revealing a profound spiritual truth about the nature of reality itself. According to Goldsmith, Jesus understood that fear exists only when we believe we are separate from the divine source of all life. When we think we must rely solely on our own limited human resources, fear naturally arises. We fear lack, loss, disease, and death because we see ourselves as vulnerable and alone. Joshua paused the recording and sat back in his chair. This perspective was entirely different from anything he had heard in church growing up. He had always thought fear not meant he should try harder to be brave, that his fear was a personal failing or lack of faith. Goldsmith continued, explaining that Jesus lived from a consciousness of oneness with God. From this awareness, he could see that the things humans fear most have no real power. Material circumstances, though they appear threatening, cannot touch the eternal spiritual reality that is our true nature. The teacher's voice grew more emphatic as he described how Jesus performed miracles not through supernatural intervention, but through spiritual understanding. He saw through the illusion of separation and recognized the presence of God, where others saw only problems and limitations. Over the following week, Joshua listened to the recording multiple times. Each time, he discovered new layers of meaning. Goldsmith taught that fear is essentially a belief in two powers, God and something else that can harm us. But spiritual truth recognizes only one power, one presence. Joshua began to see how his fear had been rooted in the belief that his well-being depended entirely on external circumstances. His job, his bank account, other people's decisions. These had seemed like the source of his security. When they disappeared, terror filled the vacuum. But Goldsmith pointed to a different foundation. He explained that our true source is the infinite intelligence and love that created the universe. This source does not fluctuate with stock markets or employment trends. It is permanent, unchanging, and always available. The concept felt radical to Joshua. Could it really be true that his security did not depend on having a job or money in the bank? Everything in his practical experience seemed to contradict this idea, yet something deep within him resonated with these words. Goldsmith addressed this exact doubt in his teaching. He acknowledged that spiritual principles seem impractical to the human mind, but he insisted that thousands of people throughout history had proven these truths by experience. When truly understood and lived, they produced tangible results in the material world. Joshua decided to test these principles in a small way. Instead of waking up and immediately diving into panic about his situation, he spent the first hour of each morning in quiet contemplation. He practiced recognizing the presence of divine intelligence within and around him. At first, his mind resisted fiercely. Thoughts of his dwindling bank account and mounting debt would intrude constantly. But he persisted, gently returning his attention to the truth that Goldsmith had illuminated. There is only one power, one source, and it is forever giving of itself. Something unexpected began to happen. The crushing weight of fear that had been his constant companion started to lift, not all at once, but gradually. In moments of quiet awareness, Joshua experienced a peace he had never known, even when his circumstances had been comfortable. This peace was not the absence of challenges or the presence of solutions. It was something deeper, a sense of being held by something vast and loving. Joshua realized this was what his grandmother had possessed, that mysterious calm that no external circumstance could disturb. He remembered Goldsmith explaining that Jesus could sleep peacefully in a boat during a raging storm because he knew the truth about God's presence. The storm was real on one level, but it could not touch the deeper reality of divine order and love. 2 weeks into his daily practice, Joshua received a call from a former colleague named Robert. They had worked together years ago, and Robert had recently started his own consulting firm. He needed someone with Joshua's specific expertise for a major project. The timing seemed miraculous, but Joshua was beginning to understand what Goldsmith taught about divine timing. When we cease blocking the flow of good through fear and anxiety, when we become receptive to divine guidance, opportunities appear that were always there but invisible to our fear-clouded vision. Joshua accepted the project, but something had fundamentally shifted in him. He no longer felt desperate or grasping. The job was welcome, but his sense of security no longer depended on it. He had touched something deeper, more reliable than any external circumstance. As he worked on Robert's project, Joshua noticed he approached challenges differently. Where he once would have panicked at difficulties, he now paused to recognize the presence of infinite intelligence available to guide him. Solutions came more easily, creativity flowed more naturally. Goldsmith had taught that when we understand why Jesus said, "Fear not," we begin to live from a different consciousness. We stop trying to manipulate circumstances through anxiety and effort. Instead, we align ourselves with the divine flow that is always moving toward greater expression and fulfillment. Robert was so impressed with Joshua's work that he offered him a permanent position as a senior consultant. The salary was higher than his previous job, and the work was more aligned with his passions. But Joshua knew this was not the real miracle. The real miracle was the transformation of his consciousness. He had discovered that his grandmother's peace was not the result of having easy circumstances. It came from understanding a spiritual truth that transcended circumstances. Fear had lost its power over him because he no longer believed in its fundamental premise. Joshua continued his morning practice of recognizing divine presence. Goldsmith had emphasized that spiritual understanding is not a one-time achievement, but a daily practice. Every day we must choose again to see through the illusion of separation and remember the truth of oneness. One morning during his contemplation, Joshua had a profound realization. He saw that every time Jesus said, "Fear not," he was inviting people to share his consciousness, his awareness of God's immediate presence. It was not a command, but an invitation to transformation. This understanding changed everything. Joshua was no longer trying to force himself to stop being afraid while still believing in all the reasons for fear. Instead, he was learning to see differently, to perceive the spiritual reality that exists beyond material appearances. Joshua began sharing his discovery with others who were struggling with fear and anxiety. He spoke carefully, knowing that these principles could sound like impractical mysticism to those who had not experienced their power. But to those who were ready, his words carried the ring of truth. He met Rebecca, a woman in her 40s who was paralyzed by fear of a health diagnosis. She had been told she might have a serious illness and was waiting for test results. The fear was consuming her, making it impossible to function normally or find any peace. Joshua shared what he had learned from Goldsmith about the nature of fear and the meaning of "fear not." He explained that Jesus was not telling her to be brave in the face of a real threat. He was revealing that the threat itself exists only in a limited perception of reality. Rebecca struggled to grasp this at first. Her body, the potential illness, the doctors and their tests, all seemed undeniably real and threatening. How could spiritual truth possibly change these concrete facts? Joshua understood her confusion because he had felt the same way. He explained that spiritual understanding does not deny the appearance of problems. Instead, it sees beyond appearances to the underlying reality of divine perfection. When we align our consciousness with this truth, the appearance itself often changes, not through our will but through divine law. Rebecca decided to try Joshua's approach while waiting for her test results. Each morning, instead of spiraling into fear scenarios, she spent time recognizing the presence of perfect life that is God. She acknowledged that her true being was spiritual, eternal, and untouchable by disease. The practice was difficult at first. Her mind kept returning to fear, analyzing symptoms, imagining worst outcomes. But gradually, like Joshua before her, she began to experience moments of profound peace. In these moments, she touched something real, something more substantial than her physical concerns. Goldsmith had taught that this peace is not escape or denial. It is the recognition of what is eternally true. Disease, lack, and danger exist in the realm of material appearance, but they have no existence in spiritual reality. As we dwell in spiritual awareness, material appearances come into alignment with spiritual truth. Rebecca's test results came back negative. There was no serious illness after all. But like Joshua with his job offer, she knew the real healing had already occurred. She had been healed of fear itself, of the belief that her life and well-being were at the mercy of material conditions. She called Joshua to thank him, her voice filled with emotion. She said she finally understood what Jesus meant by "fear not." It was not a command to be brave, but a revelation that there is nothing to fear when we understand the true nature of reality and our relationship to God. If this message is resonating with you, subscribe to this channel and activate notifications so you don't miss the spiritual insights that can transform your relationship with fear forever. Joshua's consulting work flourished, but he found himself increasingly drawn to share the spiritual principles that had transformed his life. He started a small study group focused on Goldsmith's teachings about fear, faith, and spiritual consciousness. The group met weekly in his apartment. People came from various backgrounds, each carrying their own burden of fear. Some feared financial ruin, others feared loss of loved ones, illness, failure, or loneliness. Despite their different circumstances, Joshua recognized they all suffered from the same fundamental misconception. They believed their well-being depended on external conditions remaining favorable. They believed they were separate from their source, vulnerable and alone in a threatening world. This belief is the root of all fear, and it is precisely what Jesus addressed when he repeatedly said, "Fear not." Joshua guided the group through Goldsmith's teaching systematically. They studied the idea that God is the only power, the only presence, the only life. Where God is, nothing else can be. Fear, disease, lack, and danger cannot exist in the presence of infinite good. At first, this sounded like positive thinking or wishful denial to some group members. But Joshua emphasized that Goldsmith was not teaching affirmations or mental manipulation. He was pointing to an actual spiritual reality that exists whether we acknowledge it or not. A man named Christopher joined the group, bringing a particularly challenging situation. His teenage daughter had fallen into drug addiction, and despite multiple attempts at rehabilitation, she continued to relapse. Christopher's fear for her life was overwhelming and entirely understandable. He listened to the discussions about fear with barely concealed frustration. How could spiritual principles help when his daughter's life was genuinely at risk? This was not abstract philosophy, but a real emergency requiring real action. Joshua recognized the legitimacy of Christopher's concern. But Joshua also knew that fear itself was preventing Christopher from being truly helpful to his daughter. His terror kept him reactive, controlling, and unable to see clearly. Moreover, his fear was actually an unconscious agreement with the power of addiction, affirming its reality and strength. Goldsmith taught that to truly help anyone, we must first establish ourselves in spiritual truth. We must see beyond the appearance of the problem to the spiritual perfection that is always present. This is not denial, but the highest form of practical help we can offer. Christopher was skeptical but desperate enough to try anything. Joshua suggested he spend time each day recognizing his daughter's true spiritual identity. Not the addict, not the troubled teenager, but the eternal spiritual being created in the image and likeness of God. Christopher committed to the practice, though doubt plagued him constantly. He would sit in meditation and try to see his daughter as God saw her, whole, perfect, and free. His human mind screamed that this was nonsense, that he was wasting time while she remained in danger. But gradually something shifted in Christopher's consciousness. He began to experience a deep peace about his daughter, not because circumstances had changed, but because he had touched something eternal and unchangeable. He sensed her true being beneath the troubled surface appearance. This inner shift affected his interactions with his daughter profoundly. He stopped approaching her with fear and desperation. Instead, he related to her from a place of calm certainty about her fundamental goodness and worth. He no longer saw her as broken or damaged, but as temporarily confused about her true identity. His daughter noticed the change in her father immediately. The fear and disappointment she had always sensed in him had disappeared. In its place was something she had never experienced from him before, an unshakable confidence in her despite all evidence to the contrary. Goldsmith explained that this is how spiritual healing works. When we stop empowering the problem through fear and see only the spiritual reality, we create an atmosphere in which healing can occur. We are not trying to change the person or condition, but recognizing what is eternally true. Over the following months, Christopher's daughter gradually turned away from drugs. It was not a sudden miracle, but a steady transformation. She later told her father that his change had been crucial. When he stopped being afraid for her, she stopped believing she was someone to be afraid of. The study group grew as people experienced the power of these principles in their own lives. Joshua realized that understanding why Jesus said, "Fear not," was perhaps the most practical spiritual knowledge anyone could possess. It was not abstract theology, but a key to transformation in every area of life. He continued to study Goldsmith's works more deeply, discovering that this teacher had spent his entire life helping people understand the nature of spiritual consciousness. Goldsmith had experienced his own profound transformation and dedicated himself to sharing these truths with others. One teaching particularly struck Joshua. Goldsmith explained that Jesus never fought evil, disease, or lack. He simply failed to recognize them as real powers. He saw only God, only good, only spiritual perfection. This singular vision was the source of his power and peace. This was revolutionary for Joshua. He had spent his whole life fighting his fears, trying to overcome them through willpower or positive thinking. But Goldsmith taught a different way. Rather than fighting fear, we understand it has no foundation in spiritual reality. We see through it to the truth. Amanda, a schoolteacher, joined the group carrying years of anxiety about her own adequacy and worth. She constantly feared she was not good enough, not smart enough, not capable enough. This fear colored every interaction and decision in her life. Joshua introduced her to Goldsmith's teaching that we are not human beings trying to become spiritual. We are spiritual beings who have forgotten our true nature. Our worth is not earned through achievement or proven through performance. It is inherent in our existence as expressions of divine life. This idea was difficult for Amanda to accept. Her entire identity had been built around striving to prove her value. The suggestion that she was already complete, already worthy, already enough seemed too simple. Surely she had to do something to earn peace and self-acceptance. But Goldsmith taught that this very striving is what blocks us from experiencing our inherent wholeness. When we chase after what we already have, we perpetuate the illusion of lack. When we try to become what we already are, we deny our true identity. Amanda began practicing what Goldsmith called the art of meditation, which is simply resting in the awareness of God's presence. Not trying to achieve anything or become anything, but recognizing what is already true. In these moments, her anxiety would dissolve, replaced by profound peace. The transformation in Amanda was remarkable. As she released her need to prove her worth, she became more effective as a teacher. Her students responded to her newfound calm and confidence. Parents commented on the positive change in her classroom atmosphere. She realized that her previous anxiety had actually made her less capable, not more. Fear had clouded her judgment, blocked her creativity, and exhausted her energy. By understanding why Jesus said, "Fear not," she had accessed an inner resource that made her far more effective. Joshua watched these transformations with gratitude and wonder. He had stumbled upon Goldsmith's teaching in his own darkest moment, and it had changed everything. Now he was privileged to witness the same truth transforming others, each in their own unique way. The group studied Goldsmith's explanation of Jesus' statement, "My peace I give unto you, not as the world gives." The peace Jesus offered was not dependent on circumstances being favorable. It was the peace that comes from knowing the truth about God's presence and power. This peace was what Joshua's grandmother had possessed. It was what sustained Jesus in the boat during the storm. It was what enabled Christopher to remain calm about his daughter's struggle. It was a peace that transcended all understanding because it came from a dimension beyond human reasoning. Brian, a business executive, came to the group with a different kind of fear. He was terrified of failure, of losing his status and success. He worked constantly, driven by anxiety that if he relaxed for even a moment, everything would fall apart. His health was suffering, his marriage strained. Joshua shared Goldsmith's teaching that there is no spiritual law supporting failure or loss. Divine intelligence is always moving toward greater expression, greater good, greater fulfillment. When we align with this movement instead of trying to force outcomes through anxious effort, we work with spiritual law rather than against it. Brian found this counterintuitive. In his world, success came through aggressive action, constant vigilance, and competitive drive. The idea of relaxing into divine flow while trusting spiritual law seemed like a recipe for disaster. Yet he could not deny that his current approach was destroying him. He decided to experiment with a different way of working. Before each meeting or decision, he would take a moment to recognize divine intelligence present and available. He would affirm that the outcome was already established in spiritual reality, and his role was simply to be receptive to guidance. The results surprised him. His meetings became more productive, his decisions more sound. He felt a flow and ease he had never experienced. Most remarkably, his business results actually improved as he released the anxious striving that had dominated his professional life. If you're ready to learn more about living from this higher consciousness, like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this truth today. Brian shared his experience with the group, his voice filled with amazement. He said he had always thought fear was what kept him sharp and successful. He now realized fear had been his greatest handicap, limiting his vision and exhausting his resources. Joshua explained that this was precisely what Goldsmith meant when he taught about the principle of "my grace is sufficient." When we stop trying to accomplish everything through personal effort and instead become receptive to divine grace, we tap into an infinite resource. This grace is not something we must earn or deserve. It is the natural outpouring of divine love, always available, always sufficient for every need. Fear blocks our awareness of this grace, making us believe we must struggle alone with limited resources against overwhelming odds. The group discussed how prevalent this belief is in modern culture. We are taught that life is a struggle, that we must fight for everything, that only the strong and fearful enough to keep fighting will survive. This worldview guarantees perpetual anxiety and exhaustion. Jesus offered an entirely different paradigm. He lived from the consciousness that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, that divine good is immediately available, that we need only recognize and receive what is already given. This is why he could say, "Fear not," with such confidence. Lisa, a retired nurse, brought a question that many in the group had been wondering. If spiritual truth is so powerful and fear is truly powerless, why do bad things still happen? Why do people still suffer despite faith and spiritual practice? Joshua acknowledged the legitimacy and importance of this question. He shared Goldsmith's teaching that we live in a world where most people operate from material consciousness, believing in multiple powers and accepting fear as natural. This collective consciousness creates much of the suffering we see. However, as individuals awaken to spiritual truth and establish themselves in the consciousness of God's presence, they begin to experience a different reality. They are not immune to all challenges, But they navigate them with peace and often see them transformed or resolved in unexpected ways. More importantly, their suffering changes in nature. Even when facing difficulties, they maintain an inner stability and peace that makes the experience entirely different. They know that no material circumstance can touch their true spiritual being or separate them from God's love. Goldsmith taught that Jesus himself faced persecution and crucifixion, yet he went through it without fear, maintaining his consciousness of oneness with God throughout. He demonstrated that, even in the worst material circumstances, spiritual peace and power remain unshaken. The group continued meeting for months, and Joshua watched as lives transformed in remarkable ways. Not everyone's external circumstances changed dramatically, but everyone who committed to the practice experienced the lifting of fear's burden and the emergence of profound peace. He realized that this was Goldsmith's true gift to the world. The teacher had not promised that spiritual understanding would make life easy or problem-free. He had revealed something far more valuable, a way of living that transcends circumstances and remains unshaken regardless of appearances. Joshua began writing about his experience, hoping to reach others who were suffering under the weight of fear. He wrote about that desperate night when he first heard Goldsmith's voice explaining why Jesus said, "Fear not." He described the journey from terror to peace. The writing became a book, which he self-published with no expectations. But people began finding it and sharing it with others. The message resonated because fear is perhaps the most universal human experience. Everyone knows its crushing weight and desperate seeks relief. Through emails and messages, Joshua heard story after story of lives transformed by understanding the spiritual principles Goldsmith had taught. People were discovering that fear loses its power when we understand it has no foundation in spiritual truth, when we recognize that God alone is power and presence. One message particularly moved Joshua. It was from a woman named Michelle, whose son had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. She had found Joshua's book in her darkest hour and began applying Goldsmith's principles to her situation. She did not deny the medical diagnosis or refuse treatment, but she established herself in the spiritual truth that her son's eternal being was untouchable by disease. She recognized divine life as the only life, perfect and whole. She practiced seeing her son through God's eyes, not through the lens of fear. The shift in her consciousness affected the entire family. Where there had been despair and panic, peace emerged. Her son felt the change and responded to it. The medical team noticed something different in this family, a calm certainty that seemed to support the boy's healing process. Michelle's son went into remission, defying the doctor's predictions. But as she wrote to Joshua, the real miracle had been her liberation from fear. Even if circumstances had been different, she had discovered a peace that transcended outcomes, a foundation that no external event could shake. This was exactly what Goldsmith had taught. When we understand why Jesus said, "Fear not," we are not guaranteed specific material outcomes. We are given something infinitely more valuable, entrance into a consciousness where fear cannot exist, because we know the truth about God's presence and power. Joshua reflected on his journey from that desperate night to this moment of helping others discover the same truth. He saw clearly now that his job loss and financial crisis had been essential to his awakening. Comfort had kept him spiritually asleep. Desperation had opened him to a deeper reality. This is often how spiritual awakening occurs, Goldsmith had explained. When material solutions fail and human resources are exhausted, we become receptive to spiritual truth. Crisis can be the doorway to transformation if we are willing to look beyond material appearances to spiritual reality. The study group had grown beyond Joshua's apartment, and they now met in a rented space. New people arrived each week, each carrying their own burden of fear. Joshua welcomed them, knowing they were about to discover what he had discovered, a truth that would change everything. He always began with new members the same way, sharing his own story and then explaining Goldsmith's core teaching. When Jesus said, "Fear not," he was revealing that fear exists only when we believe we are separate from God, dependent on material circumstances, vulnerable to countless threatening powers. But spiritual truth knows only one power, one presence, one life. In the awareness of this truth, fear dissolves because its foundation disappears. We are not alone, not vulnerable, not dependent on material conditions for our well-being. We are eternal spiritual beings, forever held in divine love. Timothy arrived at the group in crisis. His marriage was ending, his business failing, his health deteriorating. He felt like everything in his life was collapsing simultaneously. The fear was so intense he could barely function, and he came to the group as a last resort. Joshua recognized the desperation because he had been there himself. He knew that Timothy was actually in the perfect position to discover spiritual truth because his reliance on material solutions was completely exhausted. There was nowhere to turn but inward, to the only source that never fails. Over the following weeks, Timothy learned to practice what Goldsmith called the tabernacle within. Several times each day, he would withdraw from appearances and dwell in the awareness of God's presence. He would recognize that despite all appearances to the contrary, divine order was establishing itself in his life. At first, this seemed like futile escapism while his world burned around him. But gradually, Timothy began to experience what Joshua and others had discovered. A deep peace emerged, entirely independent of his circumstances. In that peace, clarity and wisdom arose where before there had been only panic. Goldsmith had taught that this inner peace is not passive acceptance, but the most powerful force in the universe. It is the atmosphere in which divine intelligence can work, in which solutions can appear, in which transformation becomes possible. Fear blocks this process, while peace enables it. Timothy's external circumstances did not all resolve immediately or easily. His marriage did end, though with far less acrimony than expected. His business required restructuring, but he found creative solutions he would never have seen through the fog of fear. His health began improving as stress decreased. More importantly, Timothy discovered that his sense of well-being no longer depended on any of these external factors. He had found something that could not be taken away, could not fail, could not disappoint. He had discovered his true foundation in spiritual reality. This was the ultimate meaning of Jesus' words, "Fear not." Not a command to suppress natural human emotions, but an invitation to discover the consciousness Jesus himself lived from. A consciousness where fear is impossible because we know ourselves to be inseparable from infinite good. The study group had become a community of people who had made this discovery. They came from different circumstances and backgrounds, but they shared a common experience. They had touched something real, something that transcended all material conditions, something that brought genuine peace. Joshua often thought about Goldsmith and the gift he had given the world. The teacher had spent his life illuminating these spiritual principles, helping people understand the practical implications of spiritual truth. His words had reached across time to save Joshua in his darkest hour. Years passed, and Joshua continued sharing what he had learned. His book reached more people, the study group continued to grow, and lives kept transforming. But he never lost sight of the simple truth at the heart of everything, the truth that had saved him. When we understand why Jesus said, "Fear not," we discover that fear is not overcome through courage or willpower. It dissolves through understanding. When we see clearly that God alone is power and presence, when we know ourselves to be inseparable from this infinite source, fear has no place to exist. This understanding must be renewed daily because the material world constantly contradicts it. Appearances suggest we are vulnerable, separate, dependent on favorable circumstances. The news, our bank accounts, our bodies, other people's opinions, all seem to confirm the reality of threat and danger. But spiritual truth remains unchanged by appearances. God is still the only power, still completely present, still expressing as infinite good. Our work is to remember this truth, to dwell in this awareness, to see from this consciousness rather than from the consciousness of fear. Joshua had discovered that this practice was not escape from reality, but engagement with true reality. The material world of appearances is the illusion. Spiritual truth is the reality. As we dwell in spiritual truth, even the appearance begins to reflect more harmony, more good, more of what we have always sought. On the anniversary of that desperate night when he first heard Goldsmith's voice, Joshua sat in quiet gratitude. He thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by this truth, all the fear that had been lifted, all the peace that had been discovered. He understood now that his grandmother's peace had not been mysterious or unattainable. She had simply understood what Jesus meant by "fear not." She had lived from the consciousness of God's presence, and that consciousness had sustained her through every circumstance. This same peace was available to everyone, not through special gifts or exceptional holiness, but through simple understanding. When we grasp that we are not separate from our source, that divine intelligence and love are always present and available, fear loses its foundation and power. Joshua looked at the group gathering for their weekly meeting. New faces mixed with familiar ones, all seeking the same thing: relief from fear's crushing weight. He knew that each person who truly understood these principles would go on to help others, creating an ever-widening circle of peace. This was Goldsmith's legacy and Jesus's gift to humanity. Not a religion or philosophy to believe in, but a truth to be experienced. A truth that sets us free from fear and establishes us in the consciousness of infinite good. A truth that transforms everything when we finally understand why Jesus said, "Fear not." In that understanding lies the peace that surpasses all human comprehension, the peace that is our true nature and eternal inheritance. If this teaching has touched your heart, subscribe to this channel, leave a comment sharing your experience with fear, and join our community of spiritual seekers discovering the peace that Jesus promised.
What if I told you that the very prayers you've been speaking, those desperate pleas you whisper in your darkest moments, are actually creating the opposite of what you're seeking? I know this sounds impossible, maybe even offensive to everything you've been taught about faith and prayer, but stay with me until the end of this video, because what you're about to discover might completely transform your understanding of how divine connection actually works. For most of your life, you've probably approached God the same way. You ask, you petition, you beg for what you need: financial breakthrough, physical healing, relationship restoration, inner peace. You've laid it all out, sometimes with tears streaming down your face, pouring your heart into prayers that feel like they're bouncing off the ceiling. And here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to talk about. The more intensely you ask, the more distant the answers seem to become. Has this ever happened to you? You pray with everything in you for healing, yet your body feels more broken. You cry out for financial provision, yet the bills keep mounting. You plead for peace, yet anxiety wraps itself tighter around your chest with each passing day. There's a hidden reason this keeps happening, and it has nothing to do with your worthiness or God's willingness to help you. The problem lies in something far more subtle, something operating beneath the surface of your awareness that's been sabotaging your spiritual connection without you even realizing it. Every time you approach God from a place of desperate need, every time you frame your prayer as a request for something you don't have, you're unconsciously programming your consciousness with a devastating message: I am incomplete, I am lacking, I am separate from the very thing I need. But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. Think about the energy behind asking. When you ask, what are you really saying? You're declaring that something essential is missing from your life. You're affirming separation between you and divine abundance. You're positioning yourself as spiritually impoverished, standing outside the gates of heaven, hoping someone inside will notice you. And the universe, which responds not to your words but to your energetic state, begins mirroring that frequency of lack right back to you. It's not punishment, it's resonance. You're broadcasting emptiness, so you receive more experiences of emptiness. This is why your most fervent prayers sometimes seem to make things worse instead of better. The intensity of your asking actually amplifies your focus on the problem rather than the presence of God. Your consciousness becomes so consumed with what's wrong, what's missing, what needs fixing, that you become blind to the divine flow that's been trying to reach you all along. But what if there was a completely different approach? What if instead of filling your mind with requests and demands, you learned to empty it completely and allow something extraordinary to happen instead? What if the secret isn't in the asking at all, but in the emptying? This is what the great spiritual masters throughout history discovered. Though mainstream religion rarely teaches it openly, they found that the most powerful state of being has nothing to do with petitioning God for favors or crafting the perfect prayer formula. The hidden truth they uncovered was far more radical. When you empty your mind completely of all thoughts, all strategies, all anxious calculations about how to fix your life, something remarkable happens. God doesn't just help you, God becomes you. Not your divine assistant waiting to respond to your requests, but your actual consciousness itself. Your thinking, your awareness, your very mind. Think about what this really means for a moment. You've spent your entire life believing that your thoughts are yours, that your mind belongs to you, that you're the one doing the thinking. But what if that's the illusion that's been keeping you trapped? What if your limited human perspective, with all its fear and worry and endless problem solving, is precisely what's blocking divine intelligence from flowing through you? The transformation doesn't come from thinking better thoughts or praying harder prayers. It comes from a fundamental shift in identity, from recognizing that you're not a separate being trying to get God's attention, but an expression of divine consciousness itself. Imagine the impact of this mindset shift on every area of your life. Picture yourself facing a difficult decision, but instead of frantically weighing pros and cons until your mind spins in circles, you simply empty your thoughts and allow divine wisdom to move through you. No striving, no forcing, no desperate mental gymnastics trying to figure out the right answer. Just receptivity, just openness, just space for God to fill. This isn't passivity. It's the most powerful spiritual practice there is. Behind the scenes of this simple act of emptying, infinite intelligence begins orchestrating your life in ways your limited thinking could never accomplish. If this resonated with you, I'd love for you to subscribe and join this community of spiritual seekers who are learning to shift from human thinking to divine intelligence. Every video we create together explores deeper dimensions of letting God live through you. The journey from human striving to divine flow requires one thing most people find almost impossible: releasing your grip on control. Your mind has been conditioned to believe it must manage everything, solve every problem, anticipate every outcome. But what would happen if you stopped? What if you released those anxious thoughts, like opening your hand and letting sand slip through your fingers? Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because understanding this intellectually is one thing, but recognizing what actually blocks most people from experiencing this transformation is something entirely different. There's a specific obstacle that stops this flow, and once you see it, everything changes. Write "I'm ready to empty" in the comments if this is starting to resonate with something deep inside you. The obstacle isn't what you think. Most people assume the problem is that God isn't giving them what they need, that heaven is somehow holding back blessings until they prove themselves worthy or pray the right way. But that's the fundamental misunderstanding that keeps you trapped in cycles of spiritual frustration. The hidden truth is this: the divine isn't withholding a single thing from you. Not the healing you desperately want, not the financial breakthrough you've been begging for, not the wisdom to navigate your toughest decisions, not the peace that seems to elude you no matter how hard you chase it. These gifts aren't locked away in some cosmic vault waiting for you to finally crack the code with the perfect prayer. They're flowing toward you right now, in this exact moment, like a perpetual river that never runs dry. Divine abundance, guidance, and love are streaming in your direction constantly, every second of every day. The broadcast never stops. So what's the real problem? Your consciousness is tuned to the wrong frequency. Your mind is so cluttered with anxious thoughts, desperate strategies, and fearful calculations that you literally cannot perceive what's already being given to you. Think of it like a radio station, broadcasting the most beautiful music across the entire universe. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This music has been playing since before you were born and will continue long after. You're gone. The broadcast is constant, unwavering, always there. But here's the question that changes everything. Are you tuned in to receive it? When your radio is switched off or tuned to static, the music doesn't stop playing. You're simply not positioned to hear it. When your mind is filled with fear-based thinking, when you're operating from that desperate energy of asking and begging, when you're frantically trying to control outcomes with your limited understanding, you're essentially tuned to interference. The signal is there, but you're receiving nothing but noise. This is what happens in your spiritual life every single day. Divine intelligence is constantly transmitting solutions, opportunities, breakthroughs, and revelations directly to you. The frequency never stops broadcasting, but the impact of all that anxiety, all that controlling thought, all that desperate asking creates static that drowns out the signal. Behind the scenes, infinite wisdom is trying to reach you, but your cluttered consciousness can't perceive it. The transformation begins the moment you empty your mind of interference and allow yourself to tune in. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because what happens when you actually make this shift from static to signal is where the real revelations begin to unfold in ways that will completely change how you approach every challenge in your life. Type tuning in the comments if you're recognizing how cluttered your frequency has. When you're constantly stuck in asking mode, something happens at an energetic level that most people never recognize. Every time you petition, every time you plead, every time you beg for what you need, your entire being starts vibrating with a frequency of lack. It's subtle, so subtle you might not even notice it consciously, but it's there beneath every desperate prayer, humming quietly through your consciousness. I am incomplete. I am broken. I am separate from what I need. This isn't just spiritual theory, this is energetic reality. And here's the revelation that changes everything. This vibration of lack doesn't attract what you're seeking. It actually repels it. Think about how this plays out in human relationships. When someone approaches you from desperate neediness, what's your instinctive response? You pull back. When someone relates to you from scarcity and grasping, you feel uncomfortable. You want to create distance. The same principle operates at the level of universal energy. The universe doesn't respond to your words, to your carefully crafted prayers, to your theological correctness. It responds to your energetic signature, to the frequency you're broadcasting from the core of your being. When you're vibrating at the frequency of I don't have, life mirrors that back to you with more experiences of not having. It's not punishment from an angry God. It's simply resonance, the impact of your own consciousness creating your reality. This is the hidden trap that keeps so many people spiritually stuck despite years of sincere prayer and practice. But here's where the transformation becomes possible. The moment you empty your mind of those anxious, grasping thoughts and allow God to fill that space instead, your entire energetic reality shifts. You stop broadcasting lack and start resonating with fullness. You stop embodying separation and start living from union. Something settles into your being that wasn't there before. A quiet confidence, a deep knowing that has nothing to do with ego or false bravado. It's recognition: what God has, you have. What God is, you are. This isn't arrogance or spiritual delusion. It's actually the most humble acknowledgement possible, because you're recognizing that your good doesn't come from your own efforts or clever thinking. It flows through you as divine expression. Behind the scenes of this mindset shift, tangible changes begin appearing in your real-world experience. Decisions that used to paralyze you with fear suddenly become clear, not because you're trying harder to figure things out, but because divine wisdom flows through you naturally when your own anxious thinking steps aside. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because understanding the shift intellectually is one thing, but seeing how it actually works in practical, everyday situations reveals the true power of emptying your mind and letting God fill the space. Drop divine expression in the comments if you're feeling this shift happening in your own consciousness. The beautiful thing about this practice is that it doesn't require years of training or complicated spiritual techniques. You don't need special rituals, sacred objects, or perfect conditions. The transformation begins with something so simple it almost seems too easy. Just 10 minutes of your day. That's it. 10 minutes where you stop approaching God like you're placing an order at a restaurant, rattling off your list of demands, and hoping the universe delivers what you want. Instead, you simply sit in stillness and empty your mind completely. In that emptied space, you say one simple thing to yourself: I'm now open to receive all that God is giving me. Notice what's happening in that statement. There's no begging involved, no bargaining with heaven, no desperate pleading for specific outcomes. You're not trying to convince God to do something or manifest a particular result through sheer force of will. You're simply acknowledging a truth that's already operating. Divine supply is flowing right now, and you're opening yourself to receive it. This shift might seem subtle on the surface, but behind the scenes, it's revolutionary in its impact on your consciousness. The journey from human striving to divine receptivity unfolds gradually as you make this your daily practice. Those 10 minutes become sacred space where your anxious human thinking steps aside and infinite intelligence moves through you without obstruction. You're not forcing visualizations of what you want. You're not white-knuckling your way through affirmations while secretly doubting they'll work. You're not straining to create some spiritual experience. You're simply being receptive, allowing revelations and intuitive wisdom to emerge naturally, like spring water bubbling up from an underground source that was always there beneath the surface. This is the transformation from effort to effortlessness, from the exhausting struggle of trying to control everything with your limited human mind to the grace of letting infinite wisdom think through you instead. Each day you practice this emptying. Something shifts in your awareness. You become more attuned to the divine frequency that's always broadcasting. You become more sensitive to the guidance that's been trying to reach you all along. The decisions you need to make start becoming clearer, not because you're thinking harder about them, but because you're thinking less and receiving more. Opportunities that were always there but invisible to your cluttered consciousness suddenly appear right in front of you, as if they've been waiting for you to notice them this whole time. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because what I'm about to share demonstrates how this practice actually works when you're facing real challenges. The kind of situations where emptying your mind feels almost impossible, but turns out to be exactly what unlocks the breakthrough you've been seeking. Write "I'm receiving" in the comments if you're ready to practice this emptying in your own daily life. Let me tell you about someone whose journey illustrates exactly what happens when you make this shift from desperate asking to empty receptivity. Her name was Maria, and for 3 solid years, she had been praying for financial breakthrough with an intensity that bordered on violence. Every night, she would literally shake her fists at heaven, demanding answers, begging God to fix her mounting debt and dwindling bank account. The harder she asked, the worse things became. It was like watching someone try to catch water with clenched fists. The tighter she gripped, the faster it slipped away. When Maria discovered this teaching about emptying the mind and allowing God to fill the space, her first reaction was pure fear. If I stop asking, God will forget about me completely, she thought. But desperation had brought her to a place where she was willing to try anything. For 30 days, she committed to practicing differently. Twice a day, she would sit in stillness and empty her mind of all those anxious thoughts, opening her consciousness to divine supply without demanding specific outcomes. The first 2 weeks felt brutal. Nothing seemed to be happening externally, and internally she felt almost frightened by the silence, by the absence of her usual mental strategizing. A gentle tap on the like button helps this message reach others who need to hear it right now. Your simple gesture creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can see. But behind the scenes, a profound transformation was taking place at an energetic level that she couldn't yet perceive. That constant knot of anxiety that had lived in her chest for 3 years began loosening its grip. Her sleep improved. Her decisions became clearer. By week 3, something remarkable started happening. An unexpected freelance opportunity appeared through an old contact she hadn't heard from in years. A debt she thought was permanent got mysteriously forgiven through a company restructuring. A refund check she'd completely forgotten about arrived in the mail. None of these solutions came from her striving or her clever thinking. They emerged naturally as she stopped blocking the flow with her desperate asking. The impact wasn't just financial. Her entire relationship with life had transformed from one of fear and control to one of trust and receptivity. Here's what makes this practice truly revolutionary. You don't have to wait for your meditation time to experience this shift. Throughout your entire day, in the most ordinary moments, washing dishes, sitting in traffic, standing in line at the grocery store, waiting for a meeting to start, you can pause for just a second and empty your mind while acknowledging one simple truth. God is here. This isn't asking God to show up or begging for divine intervention. It's recognizing what's already operating. The divine presence isn't somewhere else waiting for you to summon it through the right prayer formula. It's right here, right now, in this exact moment. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because these micro moments of acknowledgement throughout your day create something far more powerful than you might realize. They train your consciousness to operate from a completely different frequency, one where solutions appear that your anxious thinking could never access. Type, God is here, in the comments if you're beginning to practice this presence awareness in your everyday moments. These micro moments of recognition accumulate, training your consciousness to operate from an entirely different paradigm. Here's what most people get completely wrong when facing challenges. When something difficult appears in your life, a health issue, a financial crisis, a relationship breakdown, the automatic response is to identify the problem and then ask God to fix it. You focus intensely on what's wrong, analyzing every detail, and then you petition heaven to come in and change it. This seems logical, even responsible. But there's a hidden flaw in this approach that keeps you trapped in the very condition you're trying to escape. The breakthrough comes when you realize you're not treating the condition at all. You're treating your consciousness instead. When you're facing any challenge, instead of focusing on the problem and devising endless mental strategies to solve it, you practice something radically different. You empty your mind and say inwardly, I release this situation to divine intelligence. I open myself to receive God's perfect solution. I rest in the truth that infinite wisdom is already resolving this in ways I cannot see. Notice what's happening here. You're not analyzing the problem into smaller pieces. You're not demanding a specific outcome. You're not trying to control how the solution appears. You're emptying your limited thinking about the situation completely and allowing divine intelligence to work through it. This creates a gateway for solutions that your human mind, with all its limitations and fears, could never conceive. Behind the scenes, possibilities that were completely invisible to your anxious thinking suddenly become available. Opportunities emerge that weren't there before, not because they were created out of nothing, but because your consciousness has shifted to a frequency where you can finally perceive them. But here's where most people hit a wall that stops them completely. When you start practicing this way, emptying your mind and letting God fill the space, there's a persistent discomfort that overwhelms almost everyone, the feeling that you're doing absolutely nothing. This sensation can be so intense, so unsettling, that it drives people right back to their old patterns of asking, striving, and controlling. Asking feels active, it feels powerful, it feels like you're taking charge and making things happen. Emptying your mind, on the other hand, feels passive, lazy, even irresponsible. Your ego starts screaming at you. You have to think. You have to figure this out. You can't just sit there and do nothing. You have to make something happen. But here's the revelation that changes everything. That uncomfortable feeling of doing nothing is actually a sign that you're making real progress. What you're experiencing is the dissolution of your habitual interference with divine flow. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because understanding that this discomfort is actually progress is one thing, but recognizing what's happening at the deepest level of your identity when you empty your mind reveals the ultimate truth about who you really are. Drop "I'm releasing control" in the comments if you're recognizing this discomfort in your own spiritual journey. For your entire life, you've been operating from a fundamental belief that shapes absolutely everything you experience. That belief is this: you are a separate human being, disconnected from God, trying to get things from an external deity who may or may not respond to your requests. This belief creates the whole paradigm of asking, begging, and pleading. It positions you as a spiritual beggar, standing outside heaven's gates, hoping someone inside will throw you what you need. But what if everything you've been taught about your identity is backwards? Here's the ultimate revelation, the hidden truth that transforms absolutely everything. You are not separate from God, trying to receive gifts from an external source. You are the very consciousness of God, receiving awareness of your own infinite nature. This isn't metaphor or poetic language meant to make you feel better. This is the actual reality of your existence that's been obscured by layers of false identification. When you empty every thought and let God fill your mind, you're not getting something new that you didn't have before. You're removing the veil that has been blocking your recognition of what has always been yours. The impact of this identity shift ripples through every dimension of your existence. Behind the scenes, your entire relationship with life transforms. You stop approaching each day as a struggle to acquire what you lack and start experiencing it as a journey of discovering what you already are. Your decisions come from a completely different place, not from fear and limitation, but from infinite wisdom expressing through you. The challenges you face don't magically disappear, but your relationship to them fundamentally changes because you're no longer facing them alone with your small, frightened human mind trying to figure everything out. You're allowing divine intelligence to address them through you. This is what it means to truly empty your mind and let God fill the space. You're not trying to convince some external force to finally pay attention to your needs. You're acknowledging something that has never stopped being true. God has never stopped living through you. Divine intelligence has been flowing through your consciousness since before you were born, in every breath you've taken, in every decision you've made, even when you didn't recognize it. The only obstacle was your unawareness of this eternal truth, your conviction that you were separate and had to do everything yourself. Every moment you spend practicing this emptying, you're not creating a new spiritual reality. You're waking up to the one that's always been operating. You're removing the interference of your limited thinking and allowing what's always been present to become visible. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because recognizing this truth intellectually is just the beginning. And what I'm about to share reveals how this awareness changes the way you navigate every single aspect of your daily existence. Write, "I am awakening," in the comments if this truth is beginning to shift something fundamental in your understanding of who you are. If you've made it this far with me, I want you to know something. You're not here by accident. The fact that you've stayed through this entire exploration tells me you're genuinely ready for this shift in consciousness. You're not just casually browsing spiritual content. You're actively seeking the transformation that comes from emptying your mind and letting God fill that sacred space. I create these videos because I truly believe these insights have the power to change lives, not through my words, but through the eternal truths they point toward. If this message resonated with something deep inside you, I'd love for you to join this community of seekers who are learning to move from separation consciousness to divine receptivity. Hit that subscribe button so you can continue this journey with us, because each video explores another dimension of what it means to live from divine intelligence rather than limited human thinking. And here's what would mean the world to me. Drop a comment below saying, "This message found me, so I know you were here, that you received this, that something shifted in you as we walked through this together." Your presence in this community matters more than you realize. A simple tap on the like button helps this teaching reach others who are searching for exactly what you just discovered. It's a small gesture that creates ripples far beyond what we can see. There's a video right here that goes even deeper into how divine presence operates when you completely release the need to control outcomes. Click on it and let's continue this conversation together. I'll meet you there.